Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive into some Cold War strategy. Today, it's Eisenhower's New Look policy. We're going to see how a plan meant to contain the Soviet Union ended up impacting countries all over, from the Arctic all the way down to Central America.
It's interesting because the New Look wasn't just about military force. It relied on nuclear deterrence, but also some clever diplomacy and some, shall we say, creative intervention.
So for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, nuclear deterrence is the idea that having a ton of nukes means no one's going to want to start a war, right?
Right, it's a big game of chicken, basically. But the interesting part of the New Look was how it went beyond nukes. It was about alliances and also covert operations to keep the Soviets in check without starting an all-out war.
And that leads us to some really interesting places. Like Canada. Who knew they'd be such a major player in the Cold War?
Well, you have to remember that at the time, the Arctic was seen as a potential invasion route for the Soviets. And Canada shares a huge border with the U.S. Plus, they're right there under the Arctic. So they suddenly became super strategically important.
So geography made Canada a key player in the Cold War.
Exactly. And the U.S. wanted to make Canada a strong ally. That's how NORAD was created in 1957, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. It was all about presenting a united front against the Soviets.
NORAD is still around today, right? Crazy to think something from the Cold War is still relevant.
It shows how influential the New Look was and how it shaped thinking about security for years to come. But this alliance had a price for Canada. They agreed to house Bomark anti-aircraft missiles. And get this, those missiles had nuclear warheads.
Wow, that's a lot to ask of your neighbor. Imagine the public reaction. Nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. It must cause some issues between the two countries.
Absolutely. There was a lot of pushback in Canada. It strained their relationship with the U.S. A good example of this is Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. He refused to follow U.S. sanctions on Cuba after Fidel Castro came to power.
Cuba. Always the center of Cold War drama. Sounds like Diefenbaker wanted some independence for Canada, even while being an ally of the U.S.
Exactly. He even offered to be a mediator between the U.S. and Cuba, which didn't go over well with Eisenhower. The U.S. saw that as Canada overstepping.
So the New Look meant to contain the Soviets. Had all these other effects that reached way beyond the Iron Curtain. Even close allies like Canada felt the pressure to follow U.S. strategy.
And it wasn't limited to Canada. The New Look was felt even more strongly in Latin America, specifically in Guatemala.
Okay, so now we're going from the cold Arctic to Central America. What happened in Guatemala?
This is where we see the New Look's focus on covert intervention. In 1954, the U.S. orchestrated a coup to overthrow the elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Árbenz.
And didn't this all start because of bananas? Like a fruit company was involved, right?
You're on the right track, the United Fruit Company. A big American corporation with a lot of land in Guatemala. They felt threatened by Árbenz's land reforms. Those reforms were meant to give land to peasant farmers, and the company saw that as an attack on their profits.
Wait, so the U.S. government helped overthrow a leader to protect a fruit company? That's intense, even for the Cold War.
It's complicated, but basically, yes. The U.S. saw the land reforms as a sign that Árbenz was going communist, and they had to stop communism from spreading in the Americas.
Didn't they go a bit far, though? A whole coup?
Well, that's where the covert part of the New Look comes in. They didn't send in troops. The CIA did a complex operation with propaganda and training anti-Árbenz forces and even psychological warfare to destabilize the Guatemalan government. Yeah, it was a classic example of the New Look in action, trying to get things done without direct military action, but the results were huge and definitely not peaceful.
What happened after the coup? Did Guatemala basically become controlled by the U.S.?
Not exactly, but it wasn't good. The coup led to decades of military rule in Guatemala. Lots of human rights abuses and a civil war.
Yeah.
It really shows that even when these covert operations work, they can have terrible long-term effects.
So the U.S. was playing a dangerous game, and Guatemala paid the price. Makes you wonder if containing communism was worth it.
Historians are still debating that. And Guatemala wasn't the only case. This pattern of intervention, putting containment ahead of democracy, happened in other parts of Latin America too.
Right, like the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, which was a total failure for the U.S. And then there's Chile years later. Seems like the U.S. was obsessed with stopping any left-leaning ideas in the region, even if it meant supporting dictators.
It's a complicated legacy. These covert operations seem to work in the short term. So the U.S. started to see them as a cheaper way to fight the Cold War. Why risk a war with the Soviets when you can do things quietly, even if it means being manipulative?
Yeah, It makes sense strategically, but it still seems morally wrong. Overthrowing leaders, even if you don't like them, feels like a dangerous path. Where do you even draw the line?
That's the ethical problem with the New Look, the debate that's still going on. But the U.S. didn't only use covert action, they tried other ways to counter communism, like the Alliance for Progress.
Oh, right, I remember that. Wasn't that Kennedy's big idea?
It's exactly. It started in 1961, a huge economic aid program for Latin America. The idea was to help with development and social reforms, to address the things that made communism attractive in the first place.
So like a Marshall Plan for Latin America, win them over with money instead of military action.
That was the plan. But remember, this was after interventions like Guatemala. So many in Latin America didn't trust the U.S. They saw it as a way to stay in control disguised as help.
So even when the U.S. tried to do good, their past actions made it hard. It's like they were stuck. Stop communism, which leads to instability, which leads to more intervention.
Yeah, that's a great point. It shows the unintended consequences of the New Look. It did stop the Soviets from spreading, but it also made things unstable and created anti-American feelings.
It's clear that historians are still figuring out the New Look. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about shaping the world. And those choices still matter today. But how do historians even understand something so complex? Are there different ways of looking at it?
Definitely. Historians have different frameworks for the New Look and its impact. The four main ones are orthodox, revisionist, post-revisionist, and New Left.
Okay, let's break those down, starting with the orthodox view.
Orthodox historians think the New Look was necessary, a practical response to the Soviet threat. They say that nuclear deterrence and covert ops were effective, and they stopped a bigger war from happening.
So the ends justified the means for them. Even if it meant supporting coups and doing shady things, it was all about stopping communism.
You could say that. They believed the U.S. was doing what was best for the free world, even if some things look bad now.
All right, that's the orthodox view. What about the revisionists?
They are much more critical of the New Look. They say it hurt democracy and human rights, especially in Latin America. They think the U.S. was more interested in power and money than actually containing communism.
So they think the U.S. was acting like an empire, using the Cold War as an excuse to get what it wanted.
Kind of, yeah. They see the New Look as part of a bigger pattern of U.S. intervention, driven by self-interest, not stopping communism.
That's a pretty harsh view. So we have the pro-New Look orthodox and the critical revisionist. Where do the post-revisionists fit in?
They try to find a middle ground. They agree that the Soviets were a threat, but they also see the harm caused by U.S. intervention. They say the New Look might have worked in the short term, but it led to long-term problems and anti-American feelings.
So it's not a simple good or bad situation. It's complicated.
Right. Post-revisionists emphasize the complexity of history and the need to look at things from different angles.
Okay, and finally, the New Left historians.
They focus on the economic side of U.S. foreign policy. They see Eisenhower's actions, especially in Latin America, as being all about protecting U.S. economic interests and keeping control over resources in those regions.
So they're even more critical than the revisionists. They see the New Look as a tool of U.S. imperialism.
Yes. They emphasize the role of economics in shaping U.S. policy and how the New Look helped advance those interests.
It's wild how one policy can have so many different interpretations. Really shows you how complex history is. There's never just one right answer.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying history so interesting. It's about wrestling with all these perspectives, looking at the evidence, and then coming to your own conclusions.
So as we wrap up our look at the New Look, I'm still wondering, was it a success or a failure in the end?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it depends on what success means. If the goal was avoiding nuclear war with the Soviets, then the New Look probably worked. But like we've been talking about, it came at a big cost, especially for places like Canada and Guatemala. They got caught in the middle of this global power struggle.
It seems like the New Look had these ripple effects. Decisions made in Washington had consequences around the world, even if they didn't intend for that to happen. It shows that even well-planned policies can have unexpected results.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember about the New Look. It shows how connected global politics is and how important it is to think about the long term when you make decisions.
So what does all this mean for us today? How can understanding a Cold War policy help us now?
I think the New Look is a warning about the dangers of seeing the world only through one lens. It shows how focusing on short-term wins, even for national security, can create long-term problems and resentment. It also highlights how important diplomacy is, finding peaceful ways to solve conflicts. instead of using military force or secret operations.
It also shows how important it is to understand history from different sides. We can't just take one story as the truth. We have to question things, consider different views, and be open to challenging our own beliefs.
Exactly. That's especially important now. When we're constantly getting information from everywhere, we need to be able to tell what's true and what's not, to think critically and form our own opinions.
Well said. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us, and of course, thank you to our listeners for this deep dive into Eisenhower's New Look. It's been a fascinating trip through a really important time in history.
It has. And I hope everyone listening will keep exploring these topics, keep questioning things, and keep learning about the past, present, and future.
That's right. Keep diving deep, because understanding history helps us understand the world today. Until next time, stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.